Academy 2020, which is a series of sessions on racial inequality and systemic racism. And obviously, this is not a new issue. It's in Northern America. It's a long time already, but it became particularly salient in the course of last year, I think, with a series of incidents of police violence, and with painful evidence that the pandemic really is something where racial inequality is also highlighted. And what we thought would be particularly useful from an OB perspective was to realize that racial inequality and systemic racism is not just something we study as researchers and that we teach about, but that it's also part of our own professional practice, that it is also something that exists within academia and that exists within the academy. So we launched a series of sessions that are intended to explore issues of racial inequality and systemic racism within our own profession. And this particular session is focused on expression of race-based biases in our research process, and essentially it focused on issues of who we are, what we study, and how we study it might sometimes invite racial biases. And these are things that are interrelated, because what we study tends to in part be determined by our own experiences, and our own experiences are determined by who we are. And what we study, this determines on how we study it, what our samples are, what our methods are, etc. So these are not separate things; these are interrelated things. In which there are a range of issues where we see expressions of racial biases. And the intention of this session today is to not only explore the issue, explore the problem, talk about what exactly racial biases in our research process are, but to also move beyond awareness and also talk actions. So our intention is that at least half this session is focused not on establishing what the problem is, which is also important and which is also what we should do, but also talking about what we believe could be viable solutions to that problem. And the way we set this up is we have a wonderful group of panelists that I will introduce in a moment. We'll open with statements about the panelists, how they see the problem, as well as how they see potential solutions to that problem. We'll have a Q&A session that follows those opening statements. And as I said, it's impossible for you to just directly ask questions. So any questions, any feedback, any comments we have, we ask you to enter in the chat, and we'll moderate the Q&A. Then we'll have breakout sessions, and those breakout sessions are really focused on the question, well, if we've taken stock of these problems, what do we think are ways to address those? And the ultimate takeaway for us would be to get an inventory of suggestions of how we can deal with those problems, those expressions of racial biases and systemic racism in the research process, integrate those, and that way move forward, share them again with all the editors present here, representatives of AOM and AOM Journals Committee here, the OB community, and anybody else who is willing to listen. So ultimately, the takeaway from this session, it will take us some time to do this integration. So we'll be made available sometime after this session, but shared with everybody in this session and beyond. So really, how we also see this develop is we start by exploring the problem itself, but as we move through the session, we should increasingly be talking not about what the problem is, but what potential solutions to the problem are. In having those discussions, especially if you go into the breakout rooms and it's an open discussion, I think it's good to realize that it's an important topic, but also one that comes with a lot of sensitivity and emotion. And it's important to stay open-minded and sort of adopt a mindset of curiosity as you're learning from other people's takes on the problem, other people's experience. And especially to be aware, and now let me talk as a white guy for a moment, especially be aware of the fact that you haven't experienced it personally doesn't mean it doesn't exist. When we talk about racial bias and systemic racism, I realize that most of my knowledge as it comes to personal experience is secondhand knowledge, or it's in a sense, all of my knowledge is secondhand knowledge because I've never been on the receiving end of those biases. And that sometimes can make it difficult to fully understand the scope of those biases. And I think that's also something that's good to keep in mind as we have those discussions. That even if we have not seen it ourselves, it's out there, and it's good to become more knowledgeable about it. So having said all those things, let me now move to introducing our panel, and to start with thanking them for being here. I think we're particularly lucky to have 4 people that are exceptionally well positioned to talk to those issues. Derek Avery, Tracy Dumas, Aparna Joshi, and Mo Wang. They're all really experienced authors, experienced editors, experienced reviewers, experienced mentors of junior colleagues. They have a really deep and rich understanding of the research and publication process. And they've also deeply and carefully considered issues of racial inequality and systemic racism in our profession and in the research process. And we believe they're exceptionally well positioned to talk us through some of the issues as they see them, and to set the stage with their perspective on the problem, as well as on solutions to that problem. So what we'll do is, as I said, we'll have opening statements, 5 minutes each, not moving from one to the other in alphabetic order. So starting with Derek Avery. There will, if you hear an elegant little chime, that is the 1 minute sign telling the speaker that they have 1 minute left. So there's not somebody who forget to turn off their phone. It's functional. You will hear the same thing in the Q&A. And then it's time to move on to the next speaker. So having said that, again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for your engagement. Derek, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Don. Let's see if I can get my screen share to work. And where is it? Oh boy, that's not working. Okay, I guess I've just got a freestyle.
I make you co-host so you can now pull up the screen, share the screen.
Okay, I am trying that, but it's not showing. Ah, there we go. Let's see. Perfect. Thank you.
Is it okay now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I only have one quick slide here, but just wanted to start by trying to thank you, Don, for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I wanted to come up with something catchy and also to lighten the mood a little bit. So, you know, the title of this intro is "Play It Again, Sam," or, you know, for those who may be into, you know, music from the 90s or the 2000s, you know, this is the remix. There's a saying that we oftentimes use that, you know, is that no idea is original. And in this case, the ideas that I'm going to present about my experiences, I wish that I could say that they were original or somehow unique, but they're not. One of the articles that I had the fortune of finding when I was in graduate school was an article by Taylor Cox written in the Journal of Applied Behavioral Science in 1990 that talked about the experiences of folks doing race research in the organizational sciences. And it was just an amazingly well-written argument where he laid out the things that have happened to him. And over the course of the last 20 years where I've done this research, I can literally say it has been deja vu. So the first thing that he talks about is he talks about the dearth of researchers, the fact that we have a lot of people out there who, though they might have some interest in this space, are being steered clear of it. I was not explicitly steered clear, but I almost did this to myself. When I was in graduate school, I didn't want to study race because I didn't want to be pigeonholed as the angry black guy. So I was actually doing this to myself as a doctoral student. I have worked hard as a researcher and scholar to make sure that young people who are coming up understand that they can do this research and be respected But people are still being given this advice. Oh, why can't you do something else? Oh, you know, it would be great if you did something else. There was even a junior person who I was mentoring who had a phenomenal record coming out of graduate school and was asked by one school who had taken interest in her on the basis of her research record. And they asked her in a Skype interview, hey, it's great that you can do research, but could you just do it on something else? In addition to the dearth of researchers, there are all of these methodological obstacles, and I have tried to cull some of them together. But again, you know, having done this for a while now, I just wanted to point out some of the instances where I've been criticized for two things on the opposite ends of the same issue, and in many instances by the same journal. Right? So I've had people tell me, oh, that I have a sample that contains too many minorities. And then I've had people that say, oh, your sample has, you know, too few minorities. So if I oversample, that's a problem because now it's not representative. If I don't oversample, well, that's a problem because now I have disparate, you know, subgroup sample sizes. I've been criticized for having too small a sample, where people say, oh, you know, this can't be generalizable because your sample's too small. And then when I come in with what some would consider, you know, big data, people will say, oh, you know, this is too large. Everything is significant now. You know, how are we supposed to evaluate this, as though the effect sizes can't still be interpreted, even though I have a large sample. I've been criticized for the absolute value of effect sizes, even though they're quite comparable, even after I demonstrate how quite comparable they are to those in the research. People will say, oh, well, you know, this is still too small. I've done research on diversity climate, particularly in the context of race, where I was criticized for using it both as psychological climate. And then when we said, okay, we'll go out, we'll get different data, we'll come back with this as consensual climate, went back to the same journal, and we were told, no, you really should have conceptualized this as psychological climate. And we thought, okay, thanks for the shifting standard, we appreciate it. And then also with the, you know, the pressure for validated measures, we all understand why it is that we push people to use established measures. But in one instance, we produced a measure that we validated. The one that was in the literature had no validation evidence, and we were criticized for not having used that measure, even though there was no validity evidence for that measure, as opposed to the one which we were able to present validation evidence that even the reviewers had to concede was quite compelling. The third thing that Cox raised that I want to throw out as a recurring issue is with reviewers. I have had the fortune of working with a lot of people who are quite well established, and many of them do diversity, some don't. And they are also interdisciplinary. And one of the things that they have noticed in their experiences working with me is they all say uniformly that the worst experiences that they've had with the publication process have been working with me. Now, it could be that I'm just a really, really bad researcher, and I'm open to that prospect. But when they point to the issues about the process that really resonate with them, they're just amazed at some of the feedback that we get for different issues. So recognizing that the numbers that editors assign to issues is not always top line issues, but you know, to get top line issues like, well, why study race? Or when you present a race project, you know, having someone's top line issue be, well, what about gender? As though race is somehow illegitimate unless it's, you know, coupled with gender or something else. I had one reviewer, we replicated a three-way interaction 3 times in 3 different, you know, complementary samples, and the reviewer said, you know, yeah, I mean, your empirical evidence is really good, but I just don't believe that this happens. And that was the editor's top line issue in rejecting this revision. And I just thought to myself that can't be the primary basis. That cannot be among the primary bases for rejection. Also, I've done work with, you know, authors from around the world, and in many instances, we will be told that data from the US is somehow more generalizable than data from a country that has a much larger population than the US, which is just absurd. So I just want to leave that thought, you know, and again, it's not original because Cox has said this before, but, you know, just why is it that every time someone who doesn't do diversity work or doesn't do race work in particular has these experiences with me where they're left wondering, like, what is it about you Or what is it about this work that you're doing that is somehow different, that is eliciting this different set of reactions through this publication process that they have lots of experience with? I will stop sharing my screen at that point.
But I would have to unmute myself. Okay, so similarly to Derek, I don't have anything new to say. I am echoing comments that have been shared previously, and they'll be similar to some of what Derek has said. So independently of preparation for this session, a group of scholars of color were having a discussion about bias in publishing and their experiences in attempting to publish their work. And in the process of that conversation, we mentioned an article from Stella Como, published in Academy of Management Review, where she said some very similar comments, and she actually referenced the Taylor Cox article. And of course, they are collaborators on a number of pioneering papers. And in her article, this idea of the emperor having no clothes, the emperor is this concept of Western knowledge is both universal and superior. And she shared in this article the idea that we don't really question samples. At the time, we didn't question samples that were not diverse. We would take a study based on a sample of white male managers, and we would generalize that to the broader population without really questioning whether or not this is also a very narrow sample. And this paper is published in 1992. And it's really striking that these experiences, this theme is still current, it's still present, it's just as relevant today. And so I'll share a personal experience reporting or publishing one of my papers. We published it in 2013, and it was about how people who are racially dissimilar from their colleagues don't feel the same closeness in socializing as a result of socializing as do people who are in the majority. And before even submitting this paper, the feedback that we got both in presenting this paper at conferences and also feedback from trusted, respected colleagues and mentors was, you cannot write a paper about racial minorities. You can't have the focus be on racial minorities. And so in writing this paper and also in the publication process, we really worked to neutralize this racial dissimilarity lens or the focus on racial minorities. So we emphasized that our focus was on numerical minorities, and we ran supplementary analysis in both of the studies because the paper had two studies. We ran supplementary analysis removing underrepresented minorities from the sample so that we could say definitively, this is not about being an underrepresented minority, it's about simply being a numerical minority. So this story applies the same way to whites or people in the majority in their, if they are one of a few in their organizations. And we were praised for that additional analysis. This makes it a stronger paper. And the question is, why is that? And why is it so accepted? And the reason I have SOP in parentheses there is because that's standard operating procedure, right? To get these papers published, or it's certainly a standard approach. And if our gut reaction is, well, of course, the story is stronger if we can say that it generalizes to people other than underrepresented minorities, if that is our gut reaction, then do we have that same perspective on studies that use a sample that is not diverse, that does not include our racial minorities? And in our preparation session, I have to reference Derek again, because in our preparation for this session, we had a conversation, and he noted that there's such a stigma to being a diversity researcher that many people don't want to identify themselves as diversity scholars. And that hit me a little bit because I'm guilty. Because when I get invited to discuss diversity research, I'm like, why are people inviting me? I'm not a diversity scholar. I'm a work family scholar. I study identity, right? But now part of that is because I feel there are so many diversity scholars who are more prolific than I am. But I also feel that perhaps I have been influenced by the fact that there is some stigma attached to being seen as a diversity scholar. And these comments that I share were echoed in a conversation just a few weeks ago with other scholars. So a prolific scholar said that their diversity related papers receive higher scrutiny, more rounds before acceptance. You have to replicate the results more than non-diversity papers by the same author in different papers. If you have a sample that is focusing on underrepresented minorities, then, well, why didn't you compare it to white men? You need to show how this also affects white men in order for this to be a valid sample, or the context is not compelling or generalizable. So for example, an individual doing research on technology commercialization, but the context was in HBCU, well, you know, our audience wouldn't be interested in that. This is not a context that we see as important. And the effect is that, you know, some research is never undertaken. Some research is never submitted. And this is affecting the field and it's affecting our knowledge. And just some ideas on first steps is, you know, acknowledging and challenging our assumptions about what is an important question, what is an appropriate sample. Some ways that this has been addressed is with journal special issues or can be addressed, but then also questioning our policies and practices. Now as an editor, I often ask myself, okay, who's going to give this paper a fair read? Not a favorable read necessarily, because a critical read improves the research, but who's going to give this paper a fair shot? And how are we socialized as editors and reviewers? What's the board composition? And also a potential tool, you know, anytime we get a review, that review gets a score. And there are different criteria that could be included in that score. And could we socialize people to think about the fact that our biases may be a basis for scoring the reviews that we get, in addition to, you know, whether it was developmental, which is something added by some journals, and of course, whether it's timely. So those are my ideas and experiences, and I'll stop sharing now.
Hi, I think I'm up next. When I show share screen though, it says only whiteboard.
Wait a second. I'm actually have made you co-host. If you try again, it may be.
All right, let me do that.
Wait a second. Second, sorry.
Nope, it's not.
Can you share it now?
Okay, just 1 second, folks. Sorry.
It may be because of the version of the Zoom.
I see.
Yeah. Or you can send the PPT to me, and then I can share my screen.
Okay.
I will send you my email address.
Okay.
Maybe we start with Mo and then.
Yes. Can you? Thank you. That'd be great.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. I can go first. No worries. Yeah. All right. So let me share my screen. Oh, sorry. Let me see. Can we see the screen? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome, awesome. So yeah, so all right, so well, I had a more formal title and everything, just so you can see. So yeah, so the topic of the panel is on the anti-bias lens on OB research. So I decided to go a little bit broader. So not just on the racial differences, but rather also the international scholar experiences. I think I want to focus more on the raising awareness of biases in reviewer comments, because oftentimes we don't realize that's actually indicating some kind of bias. So so I want to use this opportunity to highlight that. All right, so when I was asked to join the panel, I was given this question, right? So how is it sometimes hard to escape the impression that the assessment of research in the review process is influenced by inferences about the author team? Well, this is a very good question. So, well, I could have spoken about my own experience, but then I feel like, oh, well, as a single person, well, it's not very generalizable. So I set out to gather some inputs from my colleagues. So those are like my colleagues working with me on papers, collaborators, friends. You know, the good thing is they are all over the world, and the good thing is most of them use actually samples from both North America and also from other countries. Okay, so they all have pretty good experience publishing. So yeah, so again, like I'm not claiming generalizability, but I'm just saying like I have sufficient sampling of the comments. So after I organize everyone's experience, actually some of the friends, they are really nice. They actually send me quotes from the review comments they received from different journals. So I did a little bit of qualitative exercise, right? So actually 4 categories of review comments emerged. And one thing I want to note is when I ask people to share experience, I ask them to think about the differential treatment they got when they used English speaking sample or samples from North America versus samples from non-English speaking or samples from non-Western culture. Okay, so it is reflecting on the differential treatment they experience. Okay, so it's not just the like absolute experience, rather it's a comparative experience. So the first category, which actually I personally experience a lot as well. So when you use non-native English speaking samples, reviewers tend to ask the authors to revise the manuscript for English language without pointing to specific issues. Okay, so reviewers, they won't say, oh yeah, you have to correct this sentence or that sentence. They won't. They just usually have a blanket statement. Sometimes it's, oh, hire a professional copy editor to proofread the manuscript. And another typical one is ask a native English speaker to go through the manuscript. Well, but the issue is this happens to native English speaker authors when they use non-native English speaking samples. So, well, that's kind of ironic, right? So, that actually happens a lot. So that's the category 1. All right, so the second category we see is when non-native English speaking samples or non-Western samples are used. Reviewers tend to be concerned about implications of cultural values to the focal research. So typically they would ask, oh, why not include cultural values in the research model? Why do you find this effect in this culture? Why not discuss the implications of culture for the findings? Well, the issues is if you use actually Western samples, you don't get this kind of questions. Okay, and then also implications of socioeconomic systems often surface as well. So such as like, oh, why not consider the differences between employees from state-owned versus private-owned organizations? Well, those kind of questions actually, at least in my experience, when I use like Western samples or Western culture samples, never came up. But, you know, so we sample those, okay? All right, so the third category, so when non-native English speaking samples or non-Western samples are used, reviewers tend to have a harder time to relate themselves to the researched phenomena. Okay, so some examples would be like, oh, the reviewer would draw on their own domestic experience to question the research phenomena. For example, actually, for a study that used studying like a daily commute, reviewer said, oh, why did you focus on public transportation commute, but not private car commute, right? So why was that important, right? And then some other time, reviewer would question, what can be learned from studying the same phenomena in a different country? Well, we already know a lot about abusive supervision in the United States. Why do we need to know about that in Germany? Well, that's an interesting question, right? So the last category, so this is actually makes me chuckle. So basically, when people use non-native English speaking samples or non-Western samples, reviewers generally have a negative view on the generalizability of the findings. So I'm using a quote because this quote is very powerful. It says, I'm concerned that both of your samples are from the country. At least one sample in a different culture would mitigate my concern. Well, so let's just imagine like every two sample study that using like a North American sample or English speaking sample would encounter that. Well, probably the authors would think the reviewers are crazy, right? So in any case, those are what I learned from my colleagues. Thank you very much.
I'm going to share the screen. Can everyone see the screen?
Yeah, hi, and could you put it on the slide presentation mode, please?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you all for having me. I hope you can hear me okay. Sorry about, I'm not very tech savvy, but thanks so much for this invitation. You know, when I was invited, it did lead to, could you stay on the, it did lead to a very reflexive exercise on my part. And just to set expectations straight, I want to say what I'll talk about is based on a highly biased sample, very non-scientific study of one person. You know, just getting that right. So move ahead, Howie. So I started with my opening research question after getting Dan's invitation, which is, how might bias play a role in OB research? And although this is a sample of one, it is a longitudinal study. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the topics that I have worked on here. Move ahead, please. An obvious answer to the topics you know, why might bias play a role? And this came up, I think, in Mo and Tracy and Derek's presentations as well, is in the topics we choose, right? That's where it reflects the most. Certainly the topics I have chosen have probably could not be viewed as mainstream. Although I have to say how we approach some of these topics, like even if you think about gender, some years back, you know, we were in a position where if you're a female faculty studying gender, it had the same credibility issues that we heard just previously, you know, in the presentations. And even when you study gender, are you taking a more mainstream sex differences approach? Can you dare to be more feminist and critical? That still remains an issue. Over the years, I've also mentored several doctoral students, and I am very aware of what I think some scholars have called third-party bias effects. You know, will a topic like this risk my students? If a student is studying something like disabilities and has that on her CV, will she get calls from Research One schools? So I think in reflecting more on this first question, I think I've certainly, like I think I saw in Derek and Tracy's presentations, maybe experienced, but also probably more internalized these biases in some way. And I've tried to navigate them in some way, maybe sometimes more successfully than others. Can you move ahead? Thank you. So the other question I asked myself is, how can I address these issues? You know, what roles have I played? So this was a more deeply troubling introspective exercise for me. The first hat that one wears is obviously that of an author, right? So that's the first go-to place when you start out. And certainly my, again, unscientific observation here is there's a high correlation between how marginal the population one studies is and the burden of proof, I think, of establishing significance and novelty. And as an author, it is a frustrating exercise, right? You have to kind of balance. Sometimes some of these are even competing tensions. The issues of generalizability versus novelty almost seem to be at odds with one another. So as an author, I definitely, it feels sometimes like it's an insurmountable barrier. It is frustrating. The questions that come up in the review process do seem highly subjective. But the second part of this question that I asked myself is that I've also been a reviewer on a number of, paper. I have been served as a reviewer for many, many years. And I thought, how many times don't we as reviewers open every review we do with our subjective appraisal of theoretical contribution and significance? Don't we consider that a cherished ideal, however subjective it may be? And it's probably also informed by our own biases about what's a significant theoretical contribution. Just click again, Howie. And finally, as an AE at AMJ, almost every review I've opened has opened with the statement about AMJ's bar for significant, reviews have opened with this. And as an AE, I have relied greatly on those reviews. And so I ended up asking myself, have I served the same demons that as an author, I've often tried to battle? And I probably have. This is my honest appraisal of my experience. Moving ahead, Howie. And so a fundamental realization that I've come upon here is really in addressing biases, perhaps a starting point is to recognize is that the authors versus gatekeepers idea is probably a false dichotomy. I think we need to embrace the fact that authors are reviewers and reviewers are authors. As we get frustrated as authors, we often, are quick to reject papers based on those very biases that we try to battle as authors. And so the bottom line for me is here basically to, can you just go ahead, just click again, is our biases as reviewers are likely to translate into our experience of bias as authors. So in this reflexive exercise, I don't know how novel or significant this bottom line is, but it is certainly my takeaway from having thought about this over the years. And so finally, I just want to, because I both teach diversity, I do research in this area, I also teach this topic. One paper that has really been very informative for me. Could you go ahead, Howie, the final slide, is actually Meyerson and Fletcher's this really cool paper on how do we design small wins? How do we develop a modest manifesto for changing the conversation or perhaps reducing bias? And if the problem recognition today is that, let's say one aspect of that problem is that we don't see marginal perspectives. We can diagnose and experiment about interventions both from the demand side, and from the supply side, and perhaps design small wins through a reviewer outreach and author outreach to figure out how to change that. So I would love to, I think I'm out of time, but I'd love to talk more about this, but with the overall bottom line being that let's not dichotomize. We are in this together. So let me be very campy and say, we're in this together and gatekeepers are us. This is a great, points to both, it may be a starting point for us to get together and find solutions today. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you all so much for sharing those really important, helpful, authentic thoughts. I'm inviting a virtual round of applause for a moment for our presenters. And excited now that we're going to move into a Q&A session. So please put your questions in the chat. I have some questions to get us started for our panelists. I'm not inviting every single panelist necessarily to comment on every question, but if you do feel that you have something particularly relevant to share, as I ask the question, please raise your hand. And I think I'm inviting Howie to spotlight the 4 panelists as we go into this part of our conversation. So clearly, there's not a shortage of opportunity to think about how bias can impact us as reviewers, authors, editors, et cetera. One of the things that we really are interested in focusing on here is building awareness and also trying to understand how we can make change. So in the spirit of continuing to build our awareness, something that did not come up quite as much were questions about our methodology in our research process. How would would you say the methods that we use in our research recognize race or complicate race in the samples, which came up, and also in how we work with and analyze data? I suppose I should have asked you just unmute and speak.
Okay, what the heck? I'll jump in. Although I think I see Mo was about to, so I should have just waited another second. No, I think that one of the obvious ways is that oftentimes, folks who are doing race research, and if we look at the literature out there, we see that a lot of the top level race research ends up using qualitative designs, right? So if we were to look at the proportion of race research involving qualitative designs, I would guess that it's probably higher than a number of other different areas. So that certainly creates, because when you're studying smaller populations, oftentimes, you're trying to figure out, well, how do I get some handle as to what's going on within this literature? And that's where, these inductive approaches can be, particularly helpful. For me personally, as someone who doesn't do a whole lot of qualitative research, one of the things that is really helpful for people to understand is the impact of disparate subgroup sample sizes on statistical power when we start looking for tests of interactions and things of that nature, right? Because people are often looking at my effect sizes for my interactions without taking that into account. And it's an important variable, because if I've got, 50,000 people in this, sample, and I've got, a really small group of minorities within that, it's going to have an impact on, what my effect sizes look like, for my interactions. So just some awareness of the impact of disparate subgroup sample sizes on statistical power would be really helpful as a general theme.
Thanks for that, Derek. Mo, did you want to chime in as well?
Oh, so I was just gonna share my experience serving on like a grants panels. So usually when we apply for grants, right? So the panel oftentimes care a lot about generalizability. So then in that case, you're almost faced with the issue of you need to oversample minorities for your grants to look legit for the competition. Then the hard part is like oversampling minorities is a high cost activity, right? So usually you need to invest way more the data collection resources to do that. So yeah, so I would say like, well, it's really in different areas of our research, right? The criteria or the convention is quite different. So depending on the purpose, I think people need to be aware of different statistical treatment when it comes to this issue. So.
Thanks so much, Mo, and I really appreciate you adding that grant panels, right? Thinking about how we get resources and the challenges that we might face in gaining those resources really resonates. Something I actually hadn't thought of as much about before, so thank you. What opportunities do we have? So what new processes do we think we might be able to use in the review process that could capitalize on racial differences? I guess another way to say something related to this is, how can consideration of race actually help us generate new questions to pursue in our research? So instead of thinking about this as the impediment, thinking about it as the opportunity.
Well, I'll just chime in. I think one thing that's kind of it seems problematic is just not accurately or adequately reporting on your samples. So regardless of your research question, we're really trying at JP to make sure people are fully reporting their samples and make that more of the norm. And then if that information can be included in a correlation matrix, then of course it sets the stage for people to do interesting follow-up work that could really inform our understanding of some issues around race in organizations or gender in organizations, even if it wasn't the primary focus of the study. So, I mean, I think those are things that take time to get people to remember to include. Oftentimes people say they didn't collect that type of data, but I think it's going to take collective effort on the part of editors and associate editors to really push authors to, at a minimum, better describe their samples and to include that information in descriptive analyses that could be helpful for people who want to explore things down the road. So that's kind of an relatively easy strategy that we could take if we had cooperation amongst those of us making those decisions on articles and pushing authors to include that information.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate that view. Derek,
Denise, can I co-sign? Yeah, I want to co-sign what Lillian just said. So I did a chapter on this recently where we went through top tier journals. I think it was either over a 5-year period or 10-year period. And it was remarkable to me how many of these articles did not even report sample characteristics. So we didn't even know who it was that they were studying. And then when you juxtapose that against the criticism that is oftentimes levied when you study someone who's not quote unquote prototypical or traditional, it's like, well, wait a minute. Why are we making this default assumption that, there's this one group that generalizes to everybody, but nobody else generalizes to that group, right? Like we can't have that both ways. So I think one of the things that dovetails with what Lillian said is I think that if we are more conscientious in just reporting and then making full use of our data, right? So a lot of the papers that I have done have come as a result of looking at papers that other people have done and seeing that they didn't test to see whether or not there were differences in the patterns that they noted or in the phenomenon that they investigated across these different demographic groups, right? So at the risk of, alienating some of my diversity scholar colleagues who are out there going, don't give away our ideas. I just think that why should we just wait for meta-analysts, to come in and to test for whether or not there are gender differences or race differences or age differences in these patterns that we're observing when we could be doing that in every single study that we report out there and presenting a much more comprehensive theory regarding how these things generalize in the extent to which they don't.
Yeah, I was just really echoing that comment that the opportunity is recognizing that this issue does not just apply to research that is explicitly on its face diversity research. And to piggyback Derek's comment about, more comprehensive theory, that it's an opportunity to enrich our theory and the way we explain and describe what's happening in organizations when we can talk about how it might be or how processes might be informed by looking at different groups. So this is not just about doing a diversity study, but recognizing that these differences are relevant for all of the studies that we do. So that presents an opportunity for us.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Dumas and Dr. Avery. I think piggybacking on that, maybe expanding it, is how can we reconsider what samples are considered generalizable, given the diverse society in which we find ourselves? So how do we help our community reconsider this question of generalizability? Parna, do you have any thoughts about that?
I've dealt with this in many different ways, even while studying gender, although I've not been a race scholar as much. And I'm not sure what the answer is other than more outreach, through reviewer outreach. I just don't know how to resolve this dilemma, really. I think a lot of it is the notion that certain samples are, no one questions the generalizability of an Fortune 500 CEOs, that same sample being used for everything in strategy research. But you try doing a study of, disabled workers, for example, right? So there are the idea that the mainstream research samples are somehow kosher is probably also what we need to unpack. When scholars use the same archival data sources to test any given number of independent and dependent variables, you have to ask yourself, how generalizable is that sample?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Joshi.
So I want to add on this. So I think the generalizability we are looking for in our type of research is not necessarily the statistical generalizability. The generalizability we're looking for is actually rendered by the theory testing we're doing. So basically, we're only using a sample. It could be a convenient sample, right? So we're using that sample to test whether the theory is correct in that specific sample. And when the theory is correct, then the generalizability of the theory is supported by one observation. Right? So we should not pretend that everything we do, like every study, the results we have can be generalizable to the population or to even a subpopulation. Unless we do population sampling, all the stats we do is not gonna be generalizable to the population, okay? What we have is a theory-based generalizability. What we have is we're collecting evidence on this theory. So I want everyone to think about that because oftentimes we mix the two. We always think, oh, what we done, if we do one study, we found this grand finding, it must be true. Well, that's not really true, right? So this is also linked to the robustness in our research. So so there are several good readings on this. If people are interested, feel free to contact me.
Thank you so much for that. It's also making me think about the centrality of North America as the publication capital for what we consider our top journals in the field, which really drive so much of the conversation. So that if the diversity of publications were distributed broadly throughout the world and we were having this problem worldwide, it would overall mitigate this, because in every other space we would be asking, well, that sample's about white men. Is that generalizable to our context? But there's a compounding effect, if you will, because where we have the base of the top journals is skewed, right, in our composition of scholars. I want to bring a question in from the chat, so definitely please keep them coming. How do we think about or deal with potential bias in artificial intelligence that's used in research? For example, artificial intelligence that is used to proofread papers. So this is kind of a new space for me. I think that's a really interesting question. Any thoughts about that? Or if we need clarification, I'm happy to ask for that too from the questioner.
I can't provide a comprehensive answer, but I can certainly provide an answer that, as Aparna said earlier, is based on an N of 1. I have done some research in this space working with a person whose disciplinary background is in information systems. And she has looked at racial bias in face recognition. And we were actually studying this archival data, and it created all of these challenges because the software that she was using allows us to take a task that would literally take thousands and thousands of person hours and do it instantaneously. But then we also had to come up with a system of checking the software, right? Because the software creates a number of errors and it makes more errors with respect to the recognition and the labeling of emotions and black faces as opposed to emotions and lighter faces. So I do think that it creates a higher degree of vigilance among researchers. We've got to figure out how we're going to spot check or how we're going to systemically ensure that these cost-saving measures that we're employing to make our research more efficient aren't skewing what we know about different processes in a way that's counterproductive.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you all. We are going to have that be the final statement for this Q&A portion of our conversation, and thank our panelists again and those who spoke up from our audience. We are moving into next, I think something that we were all very excited about, our breakout conversation, because there are certainly lots of challenges that we have evidenced, and I'm sure even more that those of you who are here participating can recognize, but we want this conversation to also be about the things that we can do to make change, and invite each of us to ponder that in a smaller group and have a conversation both about the primary problem that you think we need to address in this space around these questions of anti-bias in our research practices, and one thing that you think we can do to address it. So before we go into our breakouts, I'm going to invite Howie to put in the chat, again, a link to a Qualtrics survey. When we come back together, we'll have time to fill that out, but that has the questions in it that we want for you to consider in the breakout conversations. We're going to invite you into a breakout room to just have a discussion in a small group about the problems and the potential things that we can do to address these challenges. We're going to spend about 20 minutes in the breakout session, and we'll give you a 5-minute warning before that 20 minutes is up. But then we very much want you to come back into the main room, and we'll give you an opportunity to reflect on the conversation, and then we'll have an opportunity to wrap up our time together. So you should be invited into the breakout rooms now. We thank you so much for your participation so far, and we really thank you for what you will bring to this conversation in these breakout room discussions.
Yes, and I have posted the Qualtrics survey to the chat, so you can fill it out after coming back to the main room. And then the breakout rooms are ready now. I'm going to assign you to different rooms.
I want to thank our panel, Derek, Tracy, Aparna, and Mo, very, very much for your engaged and insightful efforts. I want to thank everybody present here for your engagement in the discussion, in entering your feedback and ideas into Qualtrics, and being part of the session. To be continued. Thank you very much and have a great day.